On this super review, let's take a look at the Apple AirPods Pro. Anyone else out there kind of feel like Apple got you? Like, I feel like it was almost exactly a year ago that there were rumors about new AirPods, and a lot of people were kind of holding off buying AirPods until the new ones came out. And then a couple months into 2019, that's this year, Apple came out with the new AirPods, which looked exactly like the old AirPods, and for the most part really are just like the original AirPods. Kind of a disappointment, but I think a lot of people, including myself, decided to stop waiting and just bought the new AirPods. Well, now Apple's got some new AirPods, and they're calling these ones Pro, and I kind of have a feeling that this is the AirPod that people were waiting for. But now it's like 6 months later, and I already bought the new AirPods, and so now I got the new AirPods, and Apple, you got me, and I don't know how I feel about it. So I don't know. Let's go ahead and open up the box. We'll find out what we get inside with the Apple AirPods Pro, and then I'm going to spend some time living with this earphone. I'll compare it to the original AirPods or the new AirPods, as well as I'll just compare it to some other Bluetooth devices that I've got that I love to use and see how do the new Pros stack up. All right, so I've been living with the Apple AirPods Pro for the past, I don't know, week and a half or so. Really trying to figure out, was it worth the wait? Was it worth the agonizing over a new pair of AirPods? Was it worth the double fake, the pump fake that Apple played on us earlier this year to get to where we're at now, where we've got the AirPods Pro? Is this the AirPod for everybody? And I'll give you a little spoiler. I don't think it is. I think it's the right AirPod for some people, but not everyone. So let's go ahead and let's get to it. It's a long story, and I'll start by talking about the physical aspects of the AirPods Pro, which, like the original AirPods, the form, the build, the fit, everything about this is some of the biggest strengths of the AirPods Pro. So, all right, the original AirPods, one of the reasons I love those things so much is that they're so small, so convenient, that you just kind of have them around all the time. And that is still the case here with the Pros. So yeah, the case is a little bit larger than the original AirPods, but I don't think that it is larger enough that it changes the way that I would use these things, if that makes sense. So there's some other true wireless earbuds that I've tried where they've got somewhat small cases, but they don't really fit comfortably into a pocket. Not the case here. The AirPods Pro still totally fit comfortably into a pocket, including they still fit into that little pocket inside of jeans, that little AirPods pocket that, I don't know, I feel like they invented jeans 150 years ago and they had the foresight to put a little micro pocket for AirPods. I think that was pretty cool, and well, the AirPods Pro still fit in there. On the topic of the case, this case, that hinge right there, it's still really satisfying. They've still done a really good job. And that might seem like a really minor thing that doesn't matter until you've owned a pair of AirPods and you've gotten used to the action. It's like having a Zippo, but maybe not quite as cool, or maybe it's the new cool and I'm just out of touch. But it is a pretty good hinge, and I think, again, Apple has done as well here on the AirPods Pro as they did with the original AirPods. Where there are actually more differences is in how these things fit, right? So that's kind of the biggest difference with the AirPods Pro, and a lot of the differences in the AirPods Pro versus the originals is gonna come down to not just how they fit, but what are the side effects of how they fit. And the big difference here is that these things will create a seal, kind of like an in-ear monitor, whereas the original AirPods are more like a traditional earbud. As far as comfort and stuff, I actually find them to be very comfortable. Maybe not quite as comfortable as the original AirPods because those things are just kind of open and airy, but I don't have any issue leaving these things in my ears all day, so that much I'm pretty happy with. One big thing about that new fit with the new AirPods that I think can't be overstated is the fact that I think that these things are gonna fit into a lot of people's ears who had trouble wearing the original AirPods. So my wife is one of those people. She really wanted to wear AirPods, but when she put them in her ears, they would just kind of fall out. She wouldn't really be able to do much with the original AirPods. With the new AirPods Pro, she doesn't have that problem. And I think that's gonna be the case for a lot of people. Me, I don't have any issue fitting either the original AirPods or the Pros, so I'm not benefiting from that too much, but I can understand how a lot of people would, and I think that's gonna be sort of a big deal with these new ones. Another one that's maybe, it's a smaller deal for sure, but have you ever watched people, you see a lot of people in the streets wearing AirPods, you ever see people wearing them wrong? Like, here, let me give you an example. You ever see people wearing their AirPods and they've got it like sticking out like that? That's wearing your AirPods wrong. And I think that it's pretty common here with the original AirPods, just because of how they fit inside your ear. It's a little bit of a loose fit and there's room for error. Here with the AirPods Pro, I think the shape is generally a more opinionated shape, which means that when you put it in your ear, it's gonna wanna fit itself a certain way. And I think that Apple has, whether intentionally or as a side effect, I think they fixed the problem of people wearing AirPods wrong. Now, I'm sure I'm gonna get proven wrong by, a number of people on the streets wearing AirPods, but I think at least at this point, I think that problem's been solved. All right, now let's get a little bit more into the weeds of the experience of living with the AirPods Pro. And as I alluded to before, a lot of the difference between these and the original AirPods is gonna come down to that fit and that seal, and we'll get into what those differences are. So one kind of cool side effect of the original AirPods being just an open earbud is that you can really wear them all day. It's a pretty common thing where I work in San Francisco for people to just leave them in their ears and go about their day. They'll walk down the street listening to music, they'll go to a coffee shop, order, leave them in their ears, go into the office, have conversations with people with them in their ears. And it's pretty common. They don't block out that much sound, so it's not really an issue. Now, when you get to the AirPods Pro and these things are creating a seal, that changes things pretty significantly. When you've got an in-ear earbud like this that's creating a seal, it's going to necessarily be blocking out a lot of that external sound. And that can be a good thing, right? If you're listening to music and you don't want outside sounds entering your ears and interfering with it, definitely you want a sealed monitor like this. It comes with a trade-off though, because now you don't have that open air sound, but the AirPods Pro, they try to give you the best of both worlds with a combination of noise canceling and transparency mode. So that noise canceling, it's actually surprisingly pretty effective here on the AirPods. You know, just having a sealed earbud in your ear is going to give you some amount of noise canceling. And you'll have that effect with a lot of, you know, even cheaper true wireless earbuds. But when you layer on an active noise canceling, the effect becomes really pretty impressive, especially for something this small. So now the noise canceling here, I would say, is not quite as good as you would get on something like the Bose 700s or the Sony XM3s. It's not quite as good as those. Those are like over-ear headphones. They've got a little bit of an advantage, but you get surprisingly close, and I think close enough that versus those bigger headphones, I don't think I would really reach for those bigger headphones, honestly. I mean, the only scenario where I can imagine preferring an over-ear headphone is maybe a long flight, right? So like the Bose or the Sonys, they've got battery life of around 20 to 30 hours, which if you've got a long flight, it's not a problem. These things have a battery life of around 4.5 hours, 5 hours. So if you're on a long flight cross country, across the United States, that's 5 hours. You're gonna be pushing the limit of the noise canceling here, and you might run out. You might have to buy a second pair of AirPods Pro. Sounds ridiculous, but I'm sure someone's gonna do it. The other thing, the transparency mode, I think is actually equally as impressive as the noise canceling. So I have tried some other headphones that have active noise canceling, and they will have a transparency mode, which I think is pretty cool. I don't think that transparency mode on those full headsets is quite as effective as something like AirPods, because I still think most people are not going to talk to you as if you don't have headphones on your head, because you still have headphones on your head. But I think with something like the AirPods, people are already used to talking to people with AirPods. So I think that transparency mode is actually going to come into play. And again, it is surprisingly effective here. Let's say the Sony XM3s, the over-ear headphones, they have a similar transparency mode, but it definitely sounds funky. Like you can tell that you're listening to the outside world through a pair of microphones. With the AirPods Pro, I think the effect is surprisingly hard to pick up that it's microphones. I mean, you can kind of tell that it's microphones, especially when like you talk, your voice is going to sound a little bit different to yourself played through a microphone into your ears. You could also sometimes, you know, like rub your hair. If you've got long hair or you're wearing a hoodie and you rub up against the microphones, it's going to create a little bit of a friction sound that's going to get played through the speakers, and that's going to tell you that you're not actually hearing the outside sounds naturally as you would with the original AirPods. But for the most part, I find the transparency mode on this pretty convincing. And I think that transparency mode actually does a pretty good job of reducing the sort of congested, closed-in feeling that you can get with a sealed monitor like this. It actually surprisingly brings back that open feeling of wearing something like the original AirPods. Now, unfortunately, I do think that these tricks, these little technology tricks that are packed into the AirPods are actually some sources of my biggest gripes with the AirPods Pro. I think that the AirPods Pro are surprisingly buggy in my experience for an Apple product. Just more hiccups with these things than I've experienced with other Apple products, and frankly, more hiccups that I've experienced here than I've experienced with most Bluetooth devices. So let me give you one example. It's a little bit vague, but worth calling out. So that active noise canceling, all right? Let's say you've got noise canceling in and you pull one of these things out of your ear. That's gonna create sort of an awkward, am I making sense? Maybe I should be showing this to you. All right, let's show this to you. Imagine I've got noise canceling turned on right now, and I take this out of my ear. This is gonna create an awkward situation where this thing is trying to noise cancel, but I'm not getting that noise canceling in this ear, and it creates a weird sensation. Now, the AirPods Pro deal with that well by disabling noise canceling on this ear. However, sometimes it's a little funky and sometimes it doesn't work quite right. Like sometimes it just doesn't disable and you do get that awkward pressure sensation. And then sometimes I'll plug this one back in and the noise canceling won't turn back on the way that I expect it to. So that's kind of one example of how that, I don't know, that techno trickery, that technological things kind of hamper the experience. Just generally, I kind of had more Bluetooth drops and like weirdness with these than I have had with the original AirPods, just like weird gobbledygook. It's pretty rare, I'll be honest, but it's more than what I expect with an Apple product. And most of the stuff, like, they're little errors that I can't reproduce reliably, and I couldn't really tell you how to reproduce them, but I did find one that I'm able to reproduce pretty reliably here. And I was also able to get my wife to reproduce the issue with a separate pair of AirPods on a separate phone. So if you're playing along with me, try this one out. So put in your AirPods, start listening to something like a podcast. And let's say you've got noise canceling turned on. Using just Siri, right? Just say, hey Siri, disable or turn off noise canceling. So what's gonna happen is that your podcast audio is gonna get paused. Siri will listen to you. It will register that you're asking to change the noise canceling, and she'll change your noise canceling. And then your podcast is gonna come back on. And this is where you're probably gonna notice one of two possible problems. Problem number one is sometimes audio only comes back into one ear. Problem number two is that sometimes audio comes back into both ears, but it's desynchronized. It's like off by a good half second. It's enough that it creates a very annoying echo problem. And in either case, the only way I was able to solve that problem was by pausing my podcast and then replaying it. I didn't really have to take them out of my ears necessarily to reset the AirPods or anything. I just had to stop playing and then resume playing. So that might seem like a really specific edge case, and it is a specific edge case, and frankly, that's the sort of thing that Apple could solve with software updates, but it's just indicative of the sorts of issues that I've kind of had throughout my experience with the AirPods Pro. I don't think that those issues are enough that they would ruin my experience with these things. Like, most of the time, you're not gonna have an issue, frankly. But you're paying $250 for these things, and you really hope to not have problems like that. And on the topic of problems that you wish you don't get for $250, if you use the AirPods Pro on an Android device, and I did for a while, I was using these on a Pixel 4, there are gonna be a couple of compromises that I think are worth knowing about. And I think they're worth knowing about because I think they're totally unnecessary and totally Apple induced, or they're Apple's fault. Apple doesn't have to do this. So problem number one, AirPods have a really cool feature where if you're wearing them in your ears, you're listening to music, you take one out, it's gonna automatically pause your music. And that's actually a really nice thing if you don't wanna be antisocial and you don't wanna have a conversation with people while listening to music. You just take one out, have a conversation, plug it back in, go about your day. When you use AirPods on Android, you don't get that feature. And that was true with the original AirPods, and it's also true here with the Pros. But I think, unfortunately, I think the Pros kind of betray the fact that Apple doesn't need to do that. Like, there's nothing that's Apple specific that detects whether or not these things are in your ear. In fact, when you're using these things on Android, you can tell that these things know they're not in your ear for one of two reasons. One, when you pull one out of your ear, it's gonna do that noise canceling balance thing, right? So it knows that this one's not in my ear, it turns off noise canceling to the one that's in my ear. The other way that I know that I know that Apple knows that they're not in my ear is that the pause play is on a click on the stem, and that click doesn't click when it's not in your ear, if that makes sense, right? You can squeeze it, but it doesn't do anything unless it's inside of your ear. And when you take it out of your ear, even when it's connected to Android, the click doesn't click. This doesn't make any sense. I realize this sounds ridiculous, but it's true. Like, there's a number of things that indicate that these things know they're not in your ear, but they will not pause your music if you happen to be connected to an Android device. And it's totally unnecessary. And I think it's kind of petty, frankly. The other thing that's totally unnecessary and kind of petty is that when you have these things connected to an Android device, there's no way to tell what the battery life is, right? I've got plenty of Bluetooth devices that tell my Android phone what their battery life is. But the AirPods don't. And that's pretty annoying because when these things get low in battery, like they make a beep sound, but it doesn't sound like a low battery warning because most Apple users already know that the battery is low. I was using these things on a Pixel 4 and I had no idea what that beep meant, except that I couldn't use the AirPods anymore. I literally had to connect these things to an iPhone to find out what that beep meant, and it meant that the battery was low. I was like, oh, cool. Thanks for telling me, Apple. So again, like, I think that it's just unnecessary, Apple, and I wish if you're paying $250 for these, even if you're not gonna use them on Apple's hardware, I don't think Apple should do that. I guess at some point we should start talking about the sound quality of the AirPods Pro. They are, in fact, earphones that make sound. They play music, they play podcasts. We should probably talk about what they sound like. And they definitely sound different than the original AirPods. If I were to define the original AirPod sound, it's kind of like an airy, upper mid-range, trebly sound with a decent mid-bass, but not a ton of bass. And I think that a lot of people complain about the bass on the original AirPods. And now here, with the AirPods Pro, a nice side effect of that seal is that you're able to create sub-bass frequencies a lot more effectively. And they do that. These things definitely have more sub-bass punch than what you get with the original AirPods. I still wouldn't describe this as an especially bassy earphone. I think if you're a bass head, you're probably still going to be disappointed with the AirPods Pro, but for most people that don't just want to crank up the bass, I think you'll be pretty happy with it. I personally am pretty satisfied with the bass levels on the Pros, and maybe if you've watched my reviews before, you know I'm not a big bass head, so maybe that's telling you something, but I don't know, I'm pretty happy with the bass. I think also the upper mid-range in the treble doesn't have quite the forwardness here that you get on the original AirPods. And that much, I would say, frankly, I miss a little bit. I think that the lower mid-range is kind of thin, which prevents these from sounding warm, right? So they're a little bit bassier, a little bit less upper mid-range, which could create sort of a warm sounding earphone, but I think that these things still lean pretty high on clarity and sharpness, if that makes any sense, but they do lose some of that upper mid-range forwardness from the original AirPods. Whether or not that's to your taste, I'll leave that to you. For me, if I'm choosing between the sound of the AirPods Pro versus the original AirPods, I actually kind of like the way that the original AirPods sound. They just got a little bit more of an airy open sound because they are an airy open earphone that, you know, these things lose a little bit of that sense of space and stage and separation. I think that these things still sound pretty good. I'm happy to listen to music on these things. Again, I think there's a nice little bass punch, but not too much bass. They just, I don't know, they're a little bit less unique sounding, frankly. If I were to say that, you know, the original AirPods, are they the best sounding earphones? No, not really, but they have a nice sound to them that I go to with certain music. These things are a little bit more generic sounding, still fairly Apple sounding, but a little bit more generic, and they lose some of the appeal for me. So out of 5 stars, I'm still gonna give the AirPods Pro a solid 4 stars. I think that in terms of like this form factor is just so good, and the number of features that they're able to pack into this thing is really pretty surprising. The Bluetooth range, I didn't really talk about that, but the Bluetooth range is excellent. Like, I think the best Bluetooth range I've ever had in any headphone. Battery life I found is excellent. Bluetooth latency is basically nil. Really pretty impressive in a lot of ways. And then you get to the noise canceling and the ambient, the transparency mode features, which give these things, I think, a real utility that is different from the original AirPods. I think for a lot of people, these things are gonna do things that the original AirPods don't. If you're on a train, I think these things, if you're like underground, right? It's loud and noisy. The AirPods Pro are gonna give you something that the original AirPods just don't. But then they also don't totally sacrifice that open air feeling because you still have access to transparency mode, and it's pretty well done. There are a surprising number of bugs and hiccups that I've experienced here with the AirPods Pro, and I'm somewhat hopeful that Apple's gonna fix some of it, but I'm not gonna bank on it. So I would expect that some of that stuff's still gonna exist. And if you're an Android user, These still might be the best true wireless earbuds you can get, but just expect that they're gonna be a couple of really annoying shortcomings that really are just Apple, I think, being kind of petty, but still, I quite like the AirPods Pro, and I can recommend these things for a lot of people. For me, I might still end up using my original AirPods a little bit more. If you're interested in checking out the AirPods Pro, or the original AirPods, I suppose, I've got links in the description down below. And while you're down there, you can hit the like button for the video, you can subscribe to the channel, and then I'll see you on the next super review.